and welcome to the History Hotline, the hottest line for all things Black history and beyond. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 80 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna Lynn Cook and I will be your host today as always. Now, I feel like I've said that about 7 times in the last few weeks. Episode 80 has been recorded numerous times, but hasn't seen the light of day for a variety of reasons. So here we are, episode 80 that will see the light of day. And it's all about Windrush Day. I'm going to be thinking about, well, what exactly are we celebrating? Because on the 22nd of June, 2022, it will be the 5th national celebration of Windrush Day and 74 years since the Windrush arrived at Tilbury Docks in Essex, and a generation of people came out of that ship and ships that followed in the 10, 20, even 30 years on from the Windrush. And as we know, the ship carried people from the Caribbean to the UK to help rebuild Britain after the Second World War. But we're not just thinking about that generation, because with Windrush there's a legacy. There's a legacy of people that follow and people that were impacted by their migration to Britain. Whilst the Windrush is the kind of name given to this time, there were 2 ships that arrived before the Windrush in 1947, and those people are also included. And as I mentioned, this kind of Windrush generation and the people we're thinking about extends to as late as arrivals in the 1970s, as people continue to answer the call for labour, to also meet their families in Britain and to see what England had to offer and offer their service.
Sees the arrival of more than 400 happy Jamaicans. They've come to seek work in Britain and are ready and willing to do any kind of job that will help the motherland along the road to prosperity. They're all full of hope for the future, so let's make them very welcome as they begin their new life over here.
The ship was not just made up of happy Jamaicans, as that Pathé News report from 1948 suggests. It was made up of people from all over the Caribbean and across the British Empire, from continents like Asia and Africa as well, and Europe. Whilst the narrative around Windrush centres on a male-dominated narrative, focusing on ex-servicemen that came in the post-war years to rebuild Britain, the story is not exactly true. As we know, women were on that ship as well, children were on that ship, and people from outside of just Jamaica, while narratives about the Windrush tend to focus on Jamaica because numbers were so large. Now, if you haven't really been plugged in to the Matrix for the past 5 years, you may not know what Windrush Day is, why it's celebrated, why it's a thing, why it's needed. Well, it was first recognised in 2017, as I said, 5 years ago, and it takes place every year on the 22nd of June to mark the anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush. And I think it shows just how much this ship, this one specific ship, signified a start of a very large and significant wave of migration. Windrush Day has been called for since around 2010, and I'm sure prior to this as well, but on paper the first record I could find in like a newspaper was in 2010. An article was written by Patrick Vernon, who wrote 100 Great Black Britons alongside others, and the call was made that in time for the 2012 Olympics there should be a day commemorating the Windrush and the Windrush generation. And interestingly enough, he cites things like Martin Luther King Day in America, because, you know, it's important that that man is celebrated there and his legacy and what he stood for. And a similar claim was made for Britain and the Windrush, that the day should be commemorated here. And Patrick Vernon said, not in 2010, but in years later, after the day had been announced and had been, you know, it had been decided that it would be nationally recognised. He said, after several years of campaigning for a national Windrush Day, it is great that the government has finally recognised this on the 70th anniversary. Sadly, one of the positive consequences of the recent Windrush scandal has been a massive media and public education history lesson on the arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June 1948, and the subsequent contribution of the Windrush generation to Britain. Patrick Vernon launched a petition in 2013 for the commemoration of a Windrush Day, and this was then followed by a campaign in 2018 at the height of the Windrush scandal. The Windrush scandal is obviously something we're going to have to talk about today in regards to the legacy of this generation and the reasons for celebrating this day. And then official backing was given by the government, and they decided it would be celebrated on the 22nd of June every year. Also supported by a grant of, I believe it was around £500,000 to be made available annually to charities and communities to continue to uphold, recognise and honour the legacy and contribution of the Windrush generation and their descendants. And also to celebrate diversity within British history, which is something that definitely needs to be done. And, you know, these conversations have been happening long before 2020 and Black Lives Matter, and in its resurgence in 2020. You know, these conversations have been under the context of Windrush and commemoration since, you know, as early as 2010. And it's interesting then how the scandal plays a part in the celebrations and its legacy. Unfortunately, the scandal being such one of trauma and shame, absolute utter shame on the British government, but not really, because it's all part of their plan anyway. But we'll get on to that shortly. Now, Windrush Day primarily honours a contribution made by people that arrived in the post-war era from the Caribbean. And, you know, this whole idea of what they've contributed, whether it be in regards to the building of Britain, the rebuilding of Britain after the war, their kind of contribution to different services such as the NHS, to transport services, teaching, construction work, you know, you name it, they've done it. This idea of recognising them solely for their contribution is very flawed, because, you know, it puts their output, their labour above their kind of humanity. These are people that were invited to come. And yes, they were invited specifically to work. But I think focusing only on that contribution, their economic contribution, is problematic. And I think it just sees Black people as like outputs for labour historically, especially when you think about the legacy and histories of slavery. You know, there's got to be a point in history where we celebrate Black people for more than their economic output and the labour that they do. And I stress that point a lot. It's something I think about a lot in my own research, because this idea of like contribution, what have you contributed, give a reason to recognise you, I think is slightly problematic. However, I'm going to use the word contribution again, because this generation of people have done more than just, you know, contribute economically, but socially and culturally, in regards to their movement to major cities and to form communities, especially that were so large in numbers in terms of Caribbean people. They became hubs for a variety of elements of Black British culture. And I'm using the term Black British quite hesitantly, because it really does group a really big number of people, a large number of people from many nations across several continents and generations as well. It's a huge generalisation, but it fits its context in a sense, because this Windrush generation, you know, didn't just come from one country. It was a large number of Black people from different places. But whether you think about music or food or entertainment, you know, there has been a significant building of a Black British kind of identity in some ways, and not everybody will identify with that, but it can be said, especially when we think about music. That's probably the biggest example I have in my mind about that. The day is simply to honour that very large wave of migration that occurred, to acknowledge their contribution, yes. And also, I think it should extend its celebrations to think about the abhorrent racism that the majority of these people dealt with. There's only so much you can celebrate when the word and term Windrush kind of is thought about. When you think about how much they had to endure at the hands of ordinary British people, the British state, the government, and at systemic levels too, in a wide range of different institutions, whether that be the healthcare system, policing, education, you name it, they faced it, housing, employment. So this racism that continues to oppress the following generations on from that original Windrush generation and other black people and brown people in this country. That's something that has to be considered. And I think it's very important. Whilst it's a celebration, yes, I don't think it's like a positive one. I personally think that this time should be used to reckon with British violence at all the different levels it occurs at. Because, I don't think there's many people. I would love to hear the name of any single person that came of that generation or after that faced not a single ounce of racism. Whether it was over or, covered and hidden and subtle, it existed and it was persistent and it really did alter and shape the lives of those people that arrived. Whether they were able to get the job they wanted or the house they wanted or, marry the person they wanted and have children and live a good life, shall we say, in quote marks. The fact that this persistent racism was still there, whether it was, not even directly meted out to them, but it was on TV, it was on television shows, you could see it on the news. It was inescapable, and I don't know what it would have been like to live in a time where racism was so persistent. Don't get me wrong, things aren't great now, but I'm happy I'm here and not there. And I think that probably says enough about racism in this country. Now, as I previously mentioned, one of the reasons that Windrush Day, came to be and it was pushed forward was because of the shame of this country in regards to the Windrush scandal. Now, it's crazy when you think about it. People that had indefinite remain to leave in this country were subject to being labelled as illegal immigrants and faced with deportation. Some of them were deported. This story has come back into the kind of media because of a report that's been leaked that should be coming out soon about this scandal. And, for me, though, it's a personal stories. It's a heartbreak that people went through. The trauma, the stress, the depression, and, that led to people dying. It led to the collapsing of families. It led to people not being able to access healthcare that they desperately needed. And those stories are what I think needs to be pushed to the fore when we think about the scandal.
37 years of paying taxes, and I got a letter saying that I was a legal immigrant. I am sweating. I haven't stopped from morning, and I'm still going on. I know it's voluntary. I've been doing this for a long time now, over 6 years. So how can I be illegal? I don't understand that word at all. When I got the letter, I thought, am I British? What am I? And I couldn't even answer that in my head.
They came at the invitation of the British government. They were citizens of British colonies or newly independent Commonwealth countries. Their passports were stamped indefinite leave to remain. But for some who were children then, that was a false promise.
If it weren't for that scandal breaking and investigations done by The Guardian in initial stages and other journalists and historians, we wouldn't know about this, and people would have been deported and facing, these insane experiences of having to prove that they're British and they have a right to be here because of the hostile immigration policy that came into play. Now, I've already talked about the history of immigration acts in this country, starting from 1905, but 1948 is where they become relevant to this generation of people, and acts in 62 and 71 all continue to limit the right of people to live and work and stay with indefinite leave in the UK. Now, the scandal itself kind of centres around the hostile environment policy. the hostile environment surrounding immigration. And this came in the 1990s to the 2000s. So this isn't a game of like, okay, it was this government or it was that government. This is something that, you know, has been a long time coming. 1990s, you know, that wasn't yesterday, that wasn't 10 years ago, that was a while ago. And it was this coupled then with the destruction of the landing cards of many people of that generation that arrived as children, which said they had indefinite leave to remain. Now, in 2012, Theresa May was Home Secretary, and this hostile policy kind of gets put into law in 2014 and 2016 acts that were passed, and it means that the burden of proof is no longer on the state to prove that you shouldn't be here, but it's on business owners, landlords, and the immigrants themselves to prove that they should be here. And business owners are forced to kind of put in more rigorous checks. Things like having your right to work documents when you apply for a job. Landlords as well, having to see if you actually have the right to live in this country before renting a property to you. Making it very difficult for anyone that doesn't have the correct paperwork or allegedly doesn't have the correct paperwork to live. Because, you know, to get a job, you need a job to have a house. You need a job to pay your taxes, to kind of suggest you should be here. So if you don't have access to all that because your documents have been destroyed because the British government, for whatever reason, want to do that, then you're going to have a hard time. That's exactly what happened. And the lady you heard from was Paulette Wilson, who has since passed away. But she was one of the stories picked up in the initial stages, as well as the story by the story of Anthony Bryan, who was also faced with deportation. And Sitting in Limbo was a BBC drama based on his life and his experiences. He was actually taken to a deportation centre, as was Paulette, and, you know, they were faced with the plane is leaving soon and you will be on it, and their families had to rally round to get lawyers. And, you know, especially back then when there was so little information available, this wasn't public knowledge that this was happening. They were having to kind of fight from their own means, their own pockets, and try and get help when they didn't even know what was happening and why it was happening. Public outrage obviously followed, and other people started to come forward and say, oh, actually, this is happening to me right now as well, or it's happened to my parent or grandparent. And obviously that led to the scandal becoming clearer in kind of the public's awareness and public knowledge. Now, as I've mentioned more recently, this conversation about scandals popped into the headlines again because a leaked report, as I said, that should be coming out soon, said that the scandal was caused by 30 years of racist immigration laws in order to reduce the number of non-white people in Britain, which sounds shocking in theory. And when I read this in an article, it was kind of said and portrayed as shocking, but it's not actually shocking. When we think about it, you know, if you think about the immigration laws historically going all the way back to 1905, every single one of them, bar the 1948 Nationality Act, was there to reduce the number of people entering the country that were not white. So why are we surprised? When we think about even today and the types of people that are welcomed with open arms, and rightly so, into this country from Ukraine, and those who are being sent to Rwanda. There's a very, very, very clear difference. And it's very easy to say, oh, you know, this was an accident. You know, those landing cards were not destroyed accidentally. Nobody can tell me that. I do not believe it. If you want to believe it, that's absolutely fine. But I cannot see how somebody that works in an office, and I believe the office was in Croydon, had no knowledge that these hundreds of landing cards, if not thousands, belonged to people that had no other way, in some cases, to prove their right to be here, coupled with this hostile immigration policy. Like, surely, if there was no hostile policy and those were destroyed, but it wasn't on you as a burden of proof to prove you shouldn't be here, you know, it would have been fine. But it wasn't. I don't see how people did that accidentally. And to be honest, there are people that came forward in the creation of the Windrush Report by Wendy Williams that came out in March 2020, coincidentally timed just as the COVID pandemic was ravaging our news. You know, every day was a death toll. Every day was COVID. They dropped the report. It was released then. And guess what? Barely anyone read it. And nobody cared about it because we had other things to focus on. They slipped it under the rug. And I think they're going to do exactly the same thing with the report that's coming out soon. Actually, I think they're holding it and it's not being released. However, there have been elements of it that have leaked, such as the fact that it was caused by 30 years of racist immigration laws, which we obviously know. It's not shocking. It might be shocking to you. If it is your first episode of the History Hotline, it might be shocking. But if it's not, it shouldn't be. Because that is the way immigration has worked in this country for so long. This report that's coming out is said to be more hard-hitting than the Windrush Review that was carried out, as I said, 2019 and released 2020 by Wendy Williams. However, it does link the outrage where hundreds of people of Caribbean heritage were detained, interrogated, and obviously some were even deported. And, it links it to this idea that there was a desire to reduce the number of black and brown-skinned people that were permitted to work and live in the UK. It'll be interesting to see how it's received when it comes out, especially as it seems to be set to contradict so openly the conclusion of that Sewell Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which came out in April 2021, which said that there is no racism in Britain, no institutional racism, and it was black people's fault that black people are doing badly. That was me, obviously paraphrasing. It did not say that, but that was the tone. There's an episode on that if you want to listen. Go back to about April 2021. I can't remember what number it is, but it's there. So that being said, when I think about the Windrush and when I think about my experience of understanding the Windrush, I don't think I've said before, but I learned about it in school, in geography, in about year 8 or 9. And we were doing migration, and we learnt about this wave of migration in particular. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That might have been how my grandparents got to this country. Didn't really know much about it. My grandparents hadn't really ever said about their arrival or anything. And I'd never thought to ask them, to be honest. I just thought one day they arrived, as it goes. And it wasn't until I'd finished my degree that this story was breaking and scandals happening, and I thought, I don't know anything about this history, and it's literally my direct family history. And so all that being said, for me, it's not painful per se, but it's annoying. It's really annoying that I came to learn about this properly of my own accord because of this scandal. My introduction in my own kind of adult memory is through being horrified by what I was reading in the news and then doing some historical reading and research about it, because at that point I wasn't really studying anything to do with Black Britain. So unfortunately, when I think about Windrush Day, whilst I'll think about and hold in my heart, the people that came of that generation that has paved the way for us as descendants of people of the Windrush generation, I can't think about that without thinking about that scandal, because I don't genuinely think that Windrush would even be a term we used and knew if it hadn't been for that scandal. And then the consequent media articles, historical literature, and the way that that's all being pushed now and that's come out of it, TV shows, documentaries, we wouldn't have all that had it not been for that scandal. And I just think that's so terrible, but it just speaks perfectly of this country. When there was a moment in history before all of this had happened, say before in the 90s or early 2000s, where people weren't being directly affected and impacted by their landing cards being destroyed. There wasn't a point where people thought, let's celebrate this generation of people. Of course, within our community there were. But there wasn't a point until this scandal broke that people said, we should celebrate, we should honour their legacy and what they achieved and contributed, if you really want to go there. And that is annoying, frustrating for me. It's become a buzzword. It's been used as an umbrella term to group a very large group of people that came across several decades. But, it also is a term that directly references the violence meted out by the British state in regards to their hostile immigration policy that continues to destroy lives and will continue to do so if nothing changes, which seems unlikely because things seem to be getting worse. Rwanda. I'll leave it there. So, this Windrush Day, please do, please celebrate. Don't let me and my kind of negativity towards the day, the moment, the event, bring your celebrations down. But I think it needs to be a time. It's pointless if it's not a time of reflection of what this country has the capacity to do to people that were invited here just because of the colour of their skin. And so, that being said, I will leave you to enjoy your week and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much for tuning in. My apologies again for the lack of episodes over the past 2 weeks. We are back. Episodes are lined up, ready to go, ready to be recorded. About a wide range of things. We're going to be thinking about the Commonwealth, I think. It's Commonwealth Games, and I'm a Brummie, so, it's all I'm seeing around the city. So we're definitely going to think about that in upcoming episodes. And, just getting back to the regular storytelling of events and moments that have gone by. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful week. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to the History Hotline. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend to tell a friend. To continue the conversation about Black history, head over to our social media platforms at the History Hotline on Instagram and at the History HL on Twitter.